Hi folks, Chuck Black here. We are doing Quokka walkthrough, or as I call it, Quokka Waka. We are in the 8th episode of Quokka walkthrough. The topic today is the user interface. So you see this stuff over here on the right. Did you ever wonder how all that pretty stuff got rendered? Well, we're going to talk about that. We're going to start at a high level, then we're going to dive down into the code, which is JavaScript. So this is not a Python discussion. It is a discussion of the front end, which is the JavaScript user interface that renders all of this stuff for us beautifully. At least I think it's kind of beautiful. It looks kind of interesting. Anyway, that's what we will be doing. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so in this Quokka walkthrough, which is number 8, we're going to be talking about the user interface. So here we have the user interface for devices. Looking at it, I have to say myself, I think it's extremely pretty. It's got these nice looking graphs here. I can go back and look at a table of the different devices and I can see their status. If I want to look at hosts, I can get information about the hosts, and it can tell me if they're up or if they're down. I can look at similar information for hosts in terms of response time and availability. Also, I have this nice summary graph. I have buttons that I can return to the host. I can go to events, and I have an event table that will allow me to look at all of these events. And if I want to sort on, let's say, is there something related to my Kali machine, then I can see all of the items by just typing this in, all of the different events related to the Kali machine. If I go back to my devices and then I drill down into my devices like I'm doing right here, I'm getting the device status. I'm looking at the status. I can also get device facts and it will give me that information. I can click on things like ARP, counters, or config. That will go out and get it from the actual device, which will take anywhere from 20 to 40 seconds because that's how long it takes to communicate with the device. I even have a menu item here that allows me to do all of these reset functions. So there's a whole lot of stuff that I can do in this user interface. How did I end up with that user interface? Well, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail at the moment, but what I want to do is show you, kind of as a tail end of our initialization discussion, show you the basics of how this user interface has been built, and that's what we're going to do right now. So let's review how the user interface actually works. We've gone over this before, but we're going to go over it again really briefly. So here I am. I'm actually at my GitHub wiki. How did I get here? The way that I got here is I typed in github.com Chuck A. Black Quokka wiki, and when I went to that, it popped up the main page for the Quokka wiki, and down at the bottom of this, after telling me a bunch of stuff, there are things, links to the description of the implementation of the Quokka server. We've gone through the actual initialization portion in this walkthrough, and then there's a discussion of the implementation of the Quokka user interface, and I click on that, and this is where I was when just a moment ago. So this is the picture I wanted to show you just to remind you what's going on. So this thing right here in the middle is the Quokka server. It has a database, it has a RESTful API, it goes out and talks to devices. It has these workers that do packet capture, etc. And then over here on the right, there's this user interface piece. And if you were to read the text that goes with it, it's going to tell you about there being two sources of the actual user interface. One is the web pages, and the other is the data for the web pages. What are we talking about there? Well, what we're talking about is this. I can demonstrate it in this picture. The actual web pages would be all of the menu items that you see here, and this navigational bar at the top, and these buttons on the left, and actually the background of these graphs. And the data is the stuff that you see actually changing. So if I was to sit here for a while, you would see the response time go up and down, etc. And so the actual data that fills it in is what comes from Quokka, and the web page framework itself is what comes from the user interface. If I was to say return to devices here, again, it's not a graph this time. It is a table, but the table and all of this stuff that you see on the screen, except for the data, comes from the user interface code, and the actual data is retrieved from the Quokka server. And the same is true, as you can imagine. If I go to events and we see these events, the events are coming from the database, the actual data, but the framework itself is coming from the user interface. And when we look at something like this, same thing. I've got these nice looking graphs that shows you a bunch of information. This framework for the page is coming from the Quokka UI, and the data that fills this stuff in, as well as these pieces of data, etc., that change depending on the host that we're talking to, that comes from the Quokka server. So what we're talking about is the actual pages themselves. And how did we create all of those pages? Well, let's take a moment and consider what I've got drawn in the box here. Now, this isn't showing everything that constitutes the user interface, but it shows some of the major components on which it's built. One of the things that it's built on is something called Node.js. You can look it up in Google. You can click on it in order to find more information about Node.js. You can download it. You can do all kinds of different things with it. But we are using Node.js in order to run this thing here, React.js. You need to have a particular version of Node.js installed, because React.js is built on top of Node.js. And in a like manner, Material UI for React is built on top of React.js. And so all of these things are contributing. When I look at this screen right here, they are contributing for me the ability to create web pages, to populate a navigational bar, to put buttons in, to create the framework for how I display the tables, etc. All of these things are made possible by Node.js, React.js, Material UI, etc. And I've written a fair amount of JavaScript code that actually makes this data become alive and interesting and represent the stuff that's in the Quokka server that I retrieve. So all of these things go into building it. Now you may ask, well, how did you get started? And the answer is pretty easy. I knew that I was going to build a user interface, or front end, also known as a front end, based on React, just because that's what I chose to do. There's Angular. There are other frameworks that you can use. I just decided to use React. I had actually never written a line of JavaScript in my life before I did this thing that you're looking at right here for this Quokka project. So I kind of was self-taught and learned as I went in a very short amount of time. And actually, as I was going back over it, I realized I haven't looked at this stuff in like 3 months. So I had to re-educate myself a little bit on what the JavaScript actually looks like and does. But the point is, there's a certain amount of code that I've written that we're going to actually look at in just a moment that is utilizing all of these frameworks that already exist and are made available to me by the nice folks that contributed open source Node.js, React, and Material UI. So that is kind of looking at the high level design. Let's look at the code. Okay, I lied. Well, I didn't actually lie. I said we would show you the code. There's some of the code. Okay, now I want to go back to what we were looking at before and give you an idea of how I actually got started with the code. And the way that I got started was the way that you will tend to do things, and we all tend to do things these days, is I began to Google information about React, and I found on the React site here there's a tutorial with a walkthrough on how to build something. And notice in big bold letters it says here, you might be tempted to skip this tutorial because you're not building games, but give it a chance. And of course, being a good software developer, I completely ignored that and did not go through this tutorial. Maybe my code would be better if I had gone through the tutorial, but just so you know, I actually haven't gone through this tutorial myself. I've looked at it, but I haven't. What I ended up doing instead, after looking at other sites, was using this script that's been written by the React people called Create React App. And I was able to create the framework for my application, and then I began to build my thing from there. So if you were to just make sure you had everything installed, follow the instructions, you could do exactly what it says here. This is what I did to create Quokka's user interface. Create React App, change directory to my app, and then do npm start, and you'd actually have a user interface that would say something. Obviously, it doesn't do even a fraction of what Quokka does. I had to flesh all of that code out, but it does get you off and running a little bit. So I didn't have any magic formula other than doing these tutorials. And if you recall, how did we build our Flask application? Well, I went to the web page that was building a large-scale Flask application, and I just followed those directions. So I did the same thing here. All right, now let's look at the code a little bit. So let's look at this code. Now, it's not intuitively obvious or readily obvious, but what I'm looking at right here is actually WebStorm. What is WebStorm? It is made by the same folks that make PyCharm and the same folks that make IntelliJ for Java, which is JetBrains, and it is designed for doing front-end type stuff with JavaScript, etc. And so I actually, there's not a free version of this, so I had to buy it, and so I got a year's subscription. I'm not sure that it was actually worth it because it just isn't providing me a ton of value. But like I say, I haven't actually looked at this stuff in 3 months or so, so I'm not actually sure what I would recommend, whether I would recommend WebStorm or, and I'm going to close this because I'm not going to look at it here, or if I go back to, let's see, do I want to stop and exit? Yes, I do. You can see things are really pretty slow. I'm up at the very top end of what my memory will hold, and that's one of the reasons that I've gotten rid of WebStorm, so that I'm not crushing my VM quite so much. And in fact, you can see that my memory usage didn't really, there it goes. All right, it made a liar out of me. It has changed. So it did go down a little bit. There's a little bit more room in memory for me to do stuff. So I just want to show stuff to you anyway in the Quokka UI. So here's something. If you have the VM and you're actually have both Quokka and Python 52 weeks, you will have seen this. If you've looked at the Quokka code at all, which is what I've been walking through, then that's where we had the controller, the models. We looked at views. We looked a little bit at workers, I think. So we looked at stuff there, but you will have noticed there was something called Quokka UI. That's where I have all of my UI code. So it's all in this same GitHub project, and so this is where it happens to live. Now, let me give you a brief overview of the code that we end up using in this React application. And this is how it built it. And so I'm kind of have been following what exactly they said I should be doing. And the basic framework is that I have my Quokka UI folder, and within it I have something called source. And within source, all of these things came for free. The only one that has anything of interest in it for me is this thing called index. So at a high level, again, I'm not going to go through all of this stuff, and you'll notice I just clicked on index.css. So this is the style sheet. We don't care about that. Like I said, I'm rusty at looking at this stuff. I wondered why that popped up a new file. Here's my index JavaScript file. And I think I was telling you that this is what was created for me, and I haven't really done a whole lot that is any different than what they had before. In fact, the only thing that really is of note is I created something called dashboard. Now, the thing that you will learn when you create React components, and again, this isn't a deep dive, this is just a high-level overview, is that you'll be creating things that we call components. And so here I'm doing an import of components / dashboard. If you were to look here, we're inside source. If I were to go down and open this up, whoa, there's a lot of stuff in here. If I was to look, yeah, sure enough, there's the dashboard right there. And that tells me that that's what I am creating. Now, I'm not going to be explaining to you all of the details of everything that is within this, certainly not at this point in time. I may create a greater amount of dive into the JavaScript that gets built later on, but for right now, we're just looking at what happens. So the dashboard is my component in which everything lives. So when I look at the user interface, so let me bring up the user interface. Is that where it is? Yeah, that's where it is. So when I bring up the user interface, everything that you see printed here, no matter whether I'm looking at hosts or devices or packet capture, or if I'm rendering some actual graph that looks kind of interesting, that is all getting driven at a high level by this thing dashboard. So this entire thing is my dashboard. So when we go down here, it's going to be a component. So this is some things that you'll need to get used to. Let me go over some of the differences in JavaScript versus Python. This is all JavaScript, right? .js is one clue that it's JavaScript, and it looks entirely different from Python. And you don't have to become a JavaScript expert, but I'm going to tell you a few things about how JavaScript works that's a little bit different than Python. In Python, what do? We do indentation. That is the most important thing. That tells us when we're in a code block. Not so with JavaScript. Now, JavaScript is like C, C++, Java, going back even further, Pascal, other languages where you denote code blocks using curly braces. So there's my beginning curly braces, and you'll notice, even though this is in PyCharm, I'm in PyCharm here, right? This is my PyCharm application that I'm running. Even though I'm in there, it knows about JavaScript enough to know, by the way, see this line over here? This is telling me how far I need to go to get to the closing curly brace. So all of this stuff, although it's indented nicely, indentation does not matter. And everything could actually be on the very same line. It wouldn't be readable by humans, but indentation is not critical. And of course, you should indent correctly just for readability, but just so that you know that. So another thing that you'll notice is that this is a class, so we are doing object-oriented-ish stuff. So I'm defining this class called dashboard. And here's something, it extends component. What exactly does that mean? Well, in 52 Weeks of Python, I will be talking about object-oriented programming, but one of the characteristics that you can utilize is the idea of class hierarchies. And in this situation, somebody, and that somebody would be the good folks at React, have created something called a component, a class called a component, and all of my components are going to extend from that. That means I inherit all of the good things that component does, and I'm just adding my own stuff to it for my dashboard. So let's go down here. Because it's a class, there's something called a constructor. That's an important word in object-oriented programming. That means this code right here is going to get called whenever I create an object that is of type or class called dashboard. So what I did here was I created a dashboard object, and this, when that runs, then this constructor will get called. And I'm basically saving some stuff. Again, you see the curly brackets. We're going to be using, everything's an object, so we're going to be using dots to denote stuff. So that's another difference. Now, again, I'm not going into this. This isn't a JavaScript class, but this is just so you know what's going on. You can see some information that I may or may not be passing, such as device name, host ID, if I'm doing that stuff. But one of the things that is important is I'm saying, this is what I want you to show in the dashboard. Now, render is what gets called in our components, and render is basically the word is used to render all of this framework, this web page framework. In other words, the things that are part of it, such as this navigation bar and the stuff on the left and the graphs in here. That is all part of render. So render is going to get called, and what I basically do here is, if I'm showing devices, then I create devices. If I'm showing hosts, I show hosts. If I'm showing compliance, I show compliance. Services, I show services. Is this starting to make sense to you? Do you see a relation? There's devices, there's compliance, there's hosts, there's services. And what is this host status or service status? Well, if I click here, then that will be my service status that you see right there. And I have a service that I'm not getting anything going on. And you know, I think I have a tricky bug where my services thread ends up dying. And so I need to look into that. I've been running for, I don't know, a week or two, not really paying much attention to it. So I've probably lost the information about that, but that's good to know. Anyway, probably should have shown you this, and then I wouldn't have been embarrassed by having a bug displayed for you. But hosts, I think, is still working. Yeah, there we go. There's my host screen. So here's some other things that you may, let's see, service status. Device dashboard is the device stuff for when I look at, I actually don't even remember, device dashboard is some extra special stuff. When I go through and I print things like the facts, it's going to render this information here. Anyway, events, capture, workers, worker status, etc. Those are the things that we are going to be creating of this. And there's another thing that I want to point out to you. So we are going to drill down into one of these components. So let's dive down into one of these components. And the one that I'm going to dive down into is going to be hosts. Now what I'm going to do here, you can't see me doing it. Remember in PyCharm how when you have something that's been defined elsewhere, you can do Control B and it will take you to it. And I'm going to do Control B right now. And you notice it says cannot find declaration to go to. And I was just thinking about this a moment ago in between taping these two different segments of this lesson, and I was wondering, well, why is that? What's messed up? Do I have something wrong? Did I lose my host file? And then it occurred to me, well, you dummy, I'm running in a PyCharm, so of course there are going to be limitations when it comes to JavaScript. I did my development in WebStorm. Obviously that will be one advantage, is I can do Control B. There are other advantages as well, but so I will have to manually open up hosts, and so that's what we're going to do now. And I've actually opened it up already. So let's look at what happens when we bring up this hosts component inside the dashboard. So here is hosts. I'm going to go to the very top of this. It's a pretty long file. You can see that it has many lines in it. How many lines does it have? 336. So it's pretty long function. I found that a lot of mine have gotten to be pretty long. They each are unique in their own way, but I suspect that there are better ways than I have done it to share code. But I really was just trying to get the user interface up and running in order to display all of the cool Python generated quokka data, and I wasn't too concerned about this. But let me describe it to you. So here we have all of our imports. Here's my host, which also extends component, and again we have our curly brackets. There's a constructor. Now interestingly, these three items here are the ones that are really of interest for normal printing of the table. All of these here have to do with the little pop-up windows. Remember the pop-up windows? When I was to go in Quokka and look at our hosts, and then if I was to, I will get a pop-up window if I attempt to do a port scan or an extended port scan or a trace route. All of those have pop-up windows, so that's what this is about. Countdown, here's a function that I defined. This is how you define functions in JavaScript. I have this function that actually is going to do my countdown timer for me. So that's how in our user interface we have this countdown timer that gets displayed, 28 seconds, 27 seconds, etc. So I'm counting down the time until I put a new go and get data again. Here's something really important and interesting. Let's take a look at this. I may spend more time at this than at other stuff. And one of the things that I want you to do is not get bogged down in a lot of the details, because this is going to look like Greek to you unless you happen to be from Greece, and then it will look like, I don't know what it'll look like to you, but my apologies for using Greek, but it will look entirely confusing to you, and that's okay, all right? So we're not going to go into a detailed deep dive into how JavaScript works with the functions and with chaining on top of those, this dot then for doing asynchronous calls. We don't need to understand that. Let's try to understand it at a high level. Request URL. So what are we doing? We're using this, our React app Quokka host. That will be the IP address where the Quokka server is. I call it Quokka host for some reason here in my environment variable, but it is the Quokka server. That's the IP address. And then I have this. Now, if we were to look at our Quokka definition, I'm going to go to views down here in Quokka, and I'm going to look at the UI views, and I'm going to search for /UI/host. Whoops, if I can spell it, H-O-S-T. So here is UI hosts. So guess what? When I call from here to this URL, this is basically what's going to happen. I'm calling this function fetch, which is going to make an HTTP request using this variable called request URL. Guess what? It's going to come in right here to the Quokka server. And depending on what was requested, we're going to get all hosts in this situation. And so that is basically what this functionality is doing. I'm going to go in to this URL and make this request. This is how you know, okay, well, I guess my Quokka service could be running on a different host than my user interface. And the answer is yes, it certainly could. So we will be making that request, and it will come in here. We will return all the hosts. That's how that linkage actually works. Now, this is an asynchronous call. So what's going to happen is this. It's going to make the request, and then, and I'm trying to figure out how to describe this in a high enough level way that everybody can understand it. What's going to happen is it's going to make the request, and then it's going to go away. But when that request receives a response, it's going to do this. It's going to deserialize the data that has come back, the JSON data that we created, and then it is going to basically come through, and we are going to do this set state functionality in order to set our host information in the table. And I just want you to understand this at a fairly high level. That's what this is going to do. Now, I knew nothing about any of this before I started to work on this, and in a short period of time, like in a week or two, of course I have a bit of an advantage on some of you anyway, in that I've written software for a very long time, but I was able to figure this by finding examples in Stack Overflow and JavaScript tutorials, etc. But this is where the magic happens. We're going to be calling fetch hosts at particular points in time, and that's when we're going to get to that data. When do we call fetch hosts? Well, if you were to look right here, I'm going to call fetch host in about 1 second. Boom, I just called fetch hosts, and I've just updated this table. Now, let me pause for a second and explain something else to you that's pretty important. Here's what I want to explain to you, and perhaps I should have done this sooner, but maybe this is a good time as any to do it. Now, when you see this countdown like it is now, boom, it's updated this table. And so I have new information in this table. It wrote it all out. Did it completely blow away this entire information on the entire screen, everything including the menu and this host table word and discovered hosts with availability and response time, and the button here? No, it did not. It only updated the data in this table. Now, in the olden days, we used to have to repaint the entire web page, and I don't know that there's any web technologies that still do that these days, unless you go to like an old rock group's web page or something like that. They always have to repaint the entire page. We don't do that. We use what came to be known at about 10 plus a little bit years ago as AJAX, which stands for asynchronous JavaScript something. I can't remember. It didn't really match, but what it meant was that you don't repaint the entire user interface. You just change the data that needs to be changed, and that is what we get with React. Is it's only updating the data that needs to be changed. So whether I'm looking at a table like this, or if I'm looking at a set of graphs like this, when it gets repainted, only the things that are necessary to get repainted are actually going to get repainted. So the refresh, when the refresh happens, if there's new data, then the data in these items will get refreshed, but the actual screen stuff will remain the same. So that was one thing that I wanted to point out. So when I do this fetch, the screen doesn't go away while we sit and twiddle our thumbs waiting for the data to come back. This happens asynchronously. When we get it, we do stuff with this data. And what we do, and I'm not going to go into this in great detail here, is we basically set this data inside as a state for this component so that I can refer to it by this name hosts. And what we will then do, remember, what do we call it when we're going to be repainting the screen, even though we're only painting a part of it? This is the word, we call it rendering. So when we're going to call this render function, which is what happens whenever our state changes, then we're going to begin to repaint stuff. Now here's what I want you to look at, and this is going to be maybe the last thing, or maybe I'll be lying to you again, I'm not sure. But I want to point this out to you. Now, I'm going to say return, and then you're going to look at this, and you're going to say, hang on just a minute. I thought we were in a JavaScript file. I thought we were executing a JavaScript function. What is the garbage that's inside here? This looks like HTML to me. And you know something? It is HTML. It uses a combination of HTML and JavaScript. So here we see HTML. This is all normal HTML type stuff. It gets a little bit more interesting when we come down here and we begin to look at things that look something like this. So we see that there's a little bit of extra interesting information in here. There's an if statement in here. That's kind of interesting. And there's another if statement down here. And down here under actions, I have things that I'm going to do If somebody clicks a particular button, then in that situation I'm going to render the host time series. I thought I got rid of all of the TS references. Anyway, I'm going to render this host time series. That's the status stuff. If they click on the button that says display, all of that stuff. There are packet capture. Here's packet capture. Here's the port scan. Here's the extended port scan. And here's the trace route. And you will notice that those sound familiar, perhaps, if you're as familiar with it as I am. So if we go back to this host screen, those are actually the definition of this time series data, or the capture of packets, packet capture, scan, extended scan, and trace route. Those are all the things that I'm defining in here. It's a combination, as you can see, of JavaScript and the HTML that we were looking at before. And as I said, I'm not going to spend the time to go into this in great level of detail. We may go into this later on, but I did want you to have a general idea. Some of you understand how this stuff works, and you may have a little bit of interest. Others of you, this may or may not be of interest. And if you're totally uninterested, my apologies. I guess you could hit the bailout button at any point in time. So that's basically how the user interface works. All of these things, whether it's hosts, let me go back to these components. If it's devices, it's going to look very similar. If it's host status, that's where we do the graphs, and the information in here is going to be fairly similar. Render, this information is a combination of HTML, and maybe there's some other stuff. What happens if we do a click? Then we're going to call this render hosts, and then here's my status graphs grid component, which is something that I did consolidate. So there's one status graphs grid for services as well as hosts, etc. And that's how we do it. That's how the user interface is built. All of these things here are components. I haven't gone into every single one. Maybe that's a subject for another time, but basically we have the index. The index references and creates a dashboard object. Dashboard object, depending on what we're being asked to do, will either show devices or hosts or compliance or services, etc. When we drill down and look at hosts, what does that do? Well, we have this render. That's where it's going to be drawing the page. And we saw, what about getting the data? Well, here is getting the data. Let's see, there's traceroute, port scan, extended port scan, fetch host. This is what I was looking for. Here's the magical thing that does the HTTP request that goes down into our user interface and gets all of our hosts for us. This is looking at the quokka server here. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. If not, perhaps when we go into it further, it will make a little more sense, but no worries. No matter whether you understand this or not, it's still good to have a little bit of background of how this whole user interface type stuff gets rendered. Okay, so let's review what we talked about. We wondered how we ended up with this really cool graphical and tabular information in the user interface. We reminded ourselves that it explains in the wiki how we're using the quokka server to get the data, and we're getting the page content from the quokka UI, and the quokka UI is built in JavaScript on top of Node.js, React.js, and Material UI. We looked a little bit at the code that was used in order to do this. We looked at the index file, which was created when we did create React app, and we saw that it was creating something called the dashboard. The dashboard is something that is, when it gets rendered, is going to render either the devices page or the host page or the compliance page or the services page, etc. And when we drill down into one of them, which is the host page, and we looked at when the host page actually gets created, this is where the magic happens in terms of getting the data. We call fetch hosts, and we go and make a request using this URL. And the URL is, this is part of Quokka service. This is where it will get entered, and we'll call get all hosts and return that information, and that will then get used to populate the screen in this render function. Once I get down there, the render function itself, we noticed, has a return statement, and when we get into the return, it's a combination of this HTML plus JavaScript. And this is what, I don't know that I mentioned this, so make sure you listen. This is what the React folks call JSX, which I think stands for JavaScript extension, but it's a combination of actual HTML information as well as stuff that looks like this that is more akin to JavaScript. So that's how it works. Hopefully some of that sunk in and stuck in your brain and will stick into your brain until you need to use it. And if not, maybe it took up a little bit of residence and will be dormant until you need it later on. Anyway, thanks for listening. Hope it was helpful.